I'm just thinking, a comparison occurs to me. Baal Shem Tov excited a certain amount of opposition by the things that he did. Havdil, so did Socrates. The Havdil means I'm talking about a holy Jew, as opposed, and then I'm talking about a non-Jew, who I would not qualify as holy. And Havdil means to distinguish, not to put them on the same page. And Socrates was killed for corrupting the youth, talking to them, introducing them to ideas. There's a story about the Baal Shem Tov that he came to a town and he was already known, and the Rav of the town got up in the morning and on his way to shul to go to daven with the minyan. There's nobody in the shul. There's nobody around the shul. Very, very unusual. And he catches a Jew in the street and says, "Where is everybody?" And he says, "There's someone in the marketplace telling stories." Oh yeah? There's someone in the marketplace telling stories? And then I come into shul to daven? So he goes to the marketplace, and there's the Baal Shem Tov, talking to people, and then I come into daven. So the Rav is outraged. He goes over and he's going to start to yell at the Baal Shem Tov and tell the people to leave him and so forth and so on. And the Baal Shem Tov is not surprised, and he's not afraid, and he's not upset. He says to the Rav, "You see those horses over there connected to that wagon that guy is driving? Why are they so quiet? Why are they so quiet? They're making a sound." What? It's time to daven. What are you talking about? I'll tell you why they're so quiet. Look at the harness around their neck. It's tight. They can't make a sound. Their harness is so tight. And that broke the Rav. That broke the Rav. Because, now I'm speaking from my superficial perspective. I can't go to the depth of the Rav or the Baal Shem Tov, obviously, but he had so tightly surrounded himself with a certain regimen that the spirit that's in him couldn't express itself. He choked off the spirit from expressing itself. Now, the wagon driver put the harness around the neck of the horse to control him. His intention was good. His intention wasn't to hurt the horse, and probably his intention wasn't to silence the horse either. He just wanted to have control of him. But it had a cost. And I think that part of the story is illustrating that service of God and the development of a human being has many dimensions, and it is possible to overemphasize one and lose sight of the other. And this is a constant struggle, because often the weakness in a person's position is not all or nothing. It's not that you're doing 1, 3, and 5 and you lift out 2 and 4 altogether. But it's the relative emphasis that you put on them, which could be less than ideal. I don't want to exaggerate and say that it's disastrous, but it could be less than ideal. So I'll give you an illustration. You know that on the night of Shavuos is a very widespread custom to stay up all night learning. And then either you daven nates or you don't. Some stay up until Alos HaShachar, and then to dawn, and then they go to sleep for 5 hours, and then they daven. It's not part of the custom to daven at nates, but it is a custom to stay up all night. And there were some people who famously said, let's do just a little calculation. You stay up all night, say, Northern Hemisphere, you get 5 hours of learning done. But of course, in the afternoon of Shavuos, you sleep. And by the time you get to the night of after Shavuos, you're out of your schedule is off. It takes you a couple of days to recover your regular schedule. Now ask yourself, do you end up with a plus of hours of learning or a minus of hours of learning over the whole 3-day period? And the calculation that these people make is that you probably end up with a minus. And therefore, if you really are committed to learning, you really love learning, you shouldn't do it. So, you can hear that. Of course, what they're counting is the number of hours of learning. They're not counting the quality of the learning. They're not counting the inspiration. They're not counting the effect of staying up all night, receiving the Torah the next morning can have on your other mitzvos that you do. So the vast majority who do have the custom say, yes, there's a loss, but the gain is worth it. Not every time when you calculate a loss, is it necessary that you must cease that activity because of the loss. There are times when the Torah itself prescribes activities which will cause a loss, and the loss is worth it. I'll give you an example. It says in the Shulchan Aruch, there's a whole siman, Miheim achotim leishev batanis. Who are those who sin by making a fast? And the Shulchan Aruch explains, if a person is making a fast as part of his tshuva that he's doing for something he's done wrong, but he can't learn because he's fasting, he can't concentrate, and his prayers are not of the same focus and intensity and so forth and so on, then when he does a fast, he's sinning, because the overall effect on his service of God is negative rather than positive. Okay, we could discuss that and talk about the overall, but that's not the point that I want to make. The point that I want to make is, but there are public fasts. And when there are public fasts, there's no excuse. And if you can't learn, too bad, don't learn. The whole community is putting up with that loss because the point of the fast is more important than the lost hours of quality learning time. So there are times when the Torah tells you that you must do something, and you know there's a cost, and what you say is the Torah wants me to pay the cost. I think this is very dramatically evidenced by a Liilui going up 3 times a year to the pilgrimage festivals in Jerusalem. I've mentioned this in the past. A person could live a week's travel from Jerusalem. That means 6 weeks on the road. You tell me how many hours he had to learn, and in what quality of learning. And as one anonymous person said to me, this was really unbelievable. I had given a shiur in Chicago on the 80th floor of some building. I came down, I was standing in the street, waiting for somebody to pick me up, and a Jew walks over to me, I don't know, and he says, where did people used to spend Yom Kippur in the times of the temple? Who are you? Like, what do you want from me? That's just out of the blue. I don't know from Harry. I don't know where they spend. He said, on the road, on the way up to the temple for Sukkot. Oh, I said, Never thought of that. Not in your shul with your box seat with the key, and not with your favorite chazan, and not with the air conditioning and the plush seats and everything else. Probably in a barn someplace, walking to Yerushalayim, or going by donkey or whatever it is, because Sukkot is only a few days away, and you haven't got time from your kippur to Sukkot. Might even be a Shabbos in between, so you can't make it. So what happens to Yom Kippur? Yom Kippur davening. And the Torah says, yeah, Yom Kippur davening in a barn. Be here for Sukkot. So there are times when the Torah itself makes these calculations. Now, that says two things. Number one, it's not impossible that the calculation should be right. And number two, we have to be very careful because calculations need to be made. But what the Baal Shem Tov seemed to have been saying to this Rav, who, by the way, became a follower of his, it was like a conversion experience, was that you have put such heavy emphasis on the nuts and bolts that the spirit that's supposed to be expressed through the nuts and bolts has been choked. And you have to restore the balance. Now, I think I mentioned this to you. The leader of the Chasidic movement, the group, it's called the Tzaddik. Typically, he didn't paskin shalos, he didn't answer direct halachic inquiries. He helped people learn how to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And a lot of what he does is setting relative balance, setting relative emphasis, and also creating strategies so as to be able to utilize the resources that you have. Creating balance is an absolutely crucial part of negotiating your use of your abilities and your resources in serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is true for everybody. It's not something that the Chasidic movement invented. For example, take an honest person who's thinking about his spiritual deficits. Very often, I would say universally, but maybe there are a few exceptions. Very often, when you make an honest assessment, you'll say, there are 11 areas in which I'm not ideal. Probably there are 111, but okay, let's say 11. Now you think, well, I have to do something about it. Okay, what should you do? Well, I should work to improve it. Which it? What it? There are 11. Should you work a little bit on each one and make a little progress in each one? Should you choose some to work on and leave the others for later so that you can make a lot of progress, let's say on 2 out of the 11? How should you choose the 2? I'm not talking about Baalei Tshuva now. I think this is true for everyone, no matter what family you came from, no matter what kind of childhood you had. So, this means sacrificing one for the sake of another. Now, of course, you should do it on your own, you should get advice from people, but it's this kind of choice that has to be made, and it should be made intelligently. Baal Shem Tov came into a time where he felt, apparently, and many others felt, that there was a kind of imbalance. Overemphasis on one aspect and underemphasis on another aspect. And he wanted to rectify it at least for some of the population. Not everybody serves God in the same way. It could be that for some people, the emphasis that was current at the time was right, but the nation loses out if that's the only strategy, that's the only weighing of priorities, and that there's nobody who's representing the other aspects of divine service. So, the Baal Shem Tov in general was trying to rectify an imbalance, and then for individuals, he and his followers, the Hasidic Rabbis, gave strategies of maximizing their potential by setting up priorities for them. And I want to specifically mention a way of setting the priorities which is wrong, and that is to do it legally. Let's just make it simple. I'm choosing between working on A or working on B, and someone says, well, which one's more important? Legally. Maybe one's the Isim, one's the Rabbanan, or one is a mitzvah whose violation carries with it a more severe penalty versus a mitzvah whose violation carries with a less severe penalty. So make your choice on legal grounds and put your first emphasis on the one that's most important. That's not the right answer. The right answer is what you should choose now to maximize the benefit in the long run. Now let's suppose that the one which legally is more important is one which will be a terrible strain, and probably, at least first time round, the person will fail to implement it. And then, as a result of that, we'll come to think, well, I see that I'm not as strong as I thought I was, and maybe I'm not as smart as I thought I was, and maybe I can't do any better, and maybe the whole system is not for me. I'm just misplaced altogether. These are the thoughts that the Yetzer Hara provides, free of charge, to undermine a person, to destroy his motivation. And then it will come out that choosing something easier, even if legally it's less significant, would have been the right choice, because in the long run, the person will make more progress. And indeed, the investment is in the long run. So I'll show you an example where the Gemara itself tells us what to do. Learning Torah. There was a question raised in the Gemara about learning Mishnayos. And many said that learning Mishnayos is very dangerous. It's very dangerous because the Mishnayos have to be explained. If you learn a lot of Mishnayos, you'll find contradictions. They have to be reconciled. The key terms have to be defined. The Mishnayos don't define the key terms. Nevertheless, the Mishnah proposes that the first 5 years of your learning should be only Mishnayos. Only Mishnayos. Till you understand the Mishnayos. Why aren't we afraid that this person is going to misunderstand what to do? Because he's not seeing the contradictions, he's not getting a full explanation, not getting definition of the terms. Why aren't we afraid of that? The answer is, well, if you want at the age of 25 that he should be a solid, competent scholar, the first thing he needs to do is know the information, know the relevant texts, know them by heart. In particular, if you start to explain something on the basis of too little information, your explanation will not be understood. So you have to go through learning and mastering, and only later start the explanation process. And in the meantime, all you have on board is Mishnayos, which, if you think about them, you're going to misunderstand them. But the Torah is set up, and the human intelligence which God created is set up in such a way that this risk has to be run. Because there's no other way to get to a position of solid scholarship. So noticing that there's a risk doesn't always mean that you don't accept the risk. So I'm not sure whether you're aware or not, but of all the people who are studying Torah in the world, maybe 0.1% study the way the Talmud said to do it. 99.9% don't. One of the great reasons that they don't is that 200, 300 years ago, the Torah came under pressure from the Haskalah, the endarkenment, and some people call it the enlightenment, but that's a misnomer. And they in particular touted their secular learning as being very intellectual, and they made fun of Torah learning as being just by rote and not with any understanding and not worthy of intelligent human beings. So the leaders of the generations pulled out the stops and said, okay, You want something sophisticated? You want something deep? We'll give it to you. And he started early in the educational process learning what's called lomdus, analysis, deep analysis for the concepts and complicated arguments and theoretical constructions, so that when somebody will come and say, I learned Kant, they say, well, I'm learning Rabbi Akiva. Thank you very much. And he was just as smart as Kant, and if you'll sit with me for 6 weeks, I'll explain to you one piece of Rabbi Akiva. If you don't get the patience, go back to Kant and enjoy yourself. He gave satisfaction, pride to a person learning Torah to say, I have something that's as or more sophisticated than yours. But that meant abandoning what the Talmud said. And I know there were protesters. The Maharal protested against it. He said you should do what it says in the Talmud. What did the others say? The others said, not that we oppose the Talmud, chas v'sholem. You can't be a faithful Jew and oppose the Talmud. But we're in an emergency situation. If we don't give to our students this sense of pride in something that's publicly worthy of honor, then they're going to not have the motivation to stay from altogether. They're not going to have the motivation to invest in the Torah lifestyle altogether. So because it's an emergency, we have to abandon what the Talmud said. So these kinds of evaluations being made all the time. More than that, you learn halachas and you learn them, and they become so familiar that you don't think about them. But let's think about this. What happens when Rosh Hashanah comes out on Shabbos? What do? Do we blow the shofar?
No.
Let's just calculate this. There are 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, right? So, okay, this is Rosh Hashanah comes out on Shabbos. It's always Sunday, right? But it's a big difference. What's the big difference? First day is Deraisa. Second day is Derabanan. Which means that year, you lose the Deraisa altogether. The whole of the Jewish people loses the mitzvah of shofar that year. Okay, why is that? Why aren't we blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah comes out on Shabbos? Deraisa, the Torah says to blow it on Shabbos also. But the rabbis say, don't blow it. Why not? Because we're afraid that somebody might be so concerned about blowing the shofar correctly that he'll want to take his shofar to an expert, and the Jew will blow it, and the expert will say that you blew it correctly and you satisfied the mitzvah, and he'll forget that it's Shabbos, and he'll carry it through a public domain, which is violating Shabbos. So now let's figure this out. What do we have on the two pans of the scale? On this side we have the mitzvah, the araisa of Tekiyah Shofar for the whole of the Jewish people this year. On this side I have only a suffix. I don't know that it'll happen. It might happen. What might happen? He might forget that it's Shabbos and carry the shofar to a public domain. That is the least significant violation of Shabbos. Because not only is it shogeg, but it's hoseg b'dvar mitzvah. He's going to do a mitzvah which reduces responsibility very greatly. So on the mere possibility that some Jew will perform the lightest possible violation of Shabbos, we cancel the mitzvah of shofar for the whole of the Jewish people, the Araisa, that year. Who weighed that up? Who weighed that up? Who calculated that? There are no rules here. You say, well, this is shofar, it's a mitzvah shiva gufo. There are no legal categories here. You have to weigh up the value and the significance of the mitzvos to decide which is more important. In this case, it's for the Am. It's not for the individual, it's for the whole nation. And the rabbi said it's better to wipe off the mitzvahs to say the Raisa of shofar this year, so as to protect against the possible violation of Shabbos. These kinds of calculations are being made all the time, and they're not simple. So it is possible for a group of people, or maybe even a whole generation, to have adopted implicitly a priority, and then someone to say, no, this priority is not correct. Here's one that was very, should I say, widespread in the time of the Baal Shem Tov. Study of Torah is a very, very important mitzvah. Some places it says it's Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, that Talmud Torah is counted equal to all the other mitzvahs. Now, one shouldn't exaggerate that. So is tzitzis counted equal to all the other mitzvahs in some respect. There are a number. Avodah Zarah is counted equal to all the other mitzvahs. So there are a number of mitzvahs that are counted equal. But still, it's said many times, how much honor should you give to a person who's studying Torah? And in particular, how much dishonor, how much disgrace should you visit on someone who isn't studying Torah? So as to have both the carrot and the stick, motivating people to study Torah. That's not obvious. That's not obvious. Is it right? Is it worthwhile to idealize the service of God by the nation as a whole, to make people who aren't studying Torah feel that they're failures? That God doesn't hear their prayers? That God doesn't care whether they put on tefillin, or make kiddush, or keep Shabbos? Is that a right spiritual investment? At the time of the Baal Shem Tov, there were people who felt quite strongly that the only successful Jewish life, and that attitude has persisted in some places to this day. The only successful Jewish life is this life of full-time study of Torah, and if you're doing something less, you are a failure. There can be bigger failures or smaller failures. If you're working for a yeshiva and helping it stay afloat financially, that's a lesser failure than becoming a Wall Street broker, but they're both failures. The Chasidic movement felt that that was a big mistake. It's a big mistake. There's a statement in the Talmud about it. Rahman Liilui, Kodesh Baruch Hu wants the heart. Someone who dedicates himself to Kodesh Baruch Hu with all of his heart gets full recognition, whether he's studying Torah or not studying Torah. That's a very different approach to how you handle motivation for studying Torah. And if you'll ask me, how do I know that? And the person who asks usually asks with a curl of the lip, I know where you're coming from. You're coming from Chassidus, which is, only for ignoramuses anyway, and just to make you feel good, but it's not serious. I'll tell you, I'm coming from the Mesilas Yesharim. Mesilas Yesharim written by Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. Everybody thinks that sefer is classic. No one has any critique on that sefer. Now, the last chapter of that sefer, the Maxala is talking about the idea of a chassid. Not in the sense of the modern Chasidic movement. He was contemporaneous with the Baal Shem Tov. As far as I know, neither one knew of the other. The word chassid goes back to the Tanakh. It's many times in the Tanakh. The service of God is divided into two phases. One is called tzaddik, and one is called chassid. Chassid is the higher phase, and the person in Mesilas Yesharim, the first 17 chapters are about becoming a tzaddik, and the last 9 chapters about becoming a chassid. Tzaddik is a person who does everything right, and he does everything right because he understands his responsibility to do it right. Does it right because Kodesh Baruch Hu commanded him to do it right. Does it in that sense lishma. The tzaddik's attitude, I'm oversimplifying now, but you can think of that tzaddik's attitude like this. I have a checklist of things that need to be done. And I go through my day, and every moment I make sure that I do what needs to be done. I check it off. And if everything's checked off at the end of the day, I had a successful day. I did everything that was supposed to do because God wants me to do it. That's the tzaddik. The chassid is characterized by his motivation to please God. That God should be happy with his creation because his will was done. It's not duty and responsibility. It's love and caring for God. There's a motivation of ahava, which in our Sfarim is a higher motivation. And the difference between the two can be brought out this way. The tzaddik has his list of things to be done, and he makes sure that he does something, does all of them. The chassid has a list of time periods, and he asks, did I serve God in that time period? He checks off the time periods. That means at the end of his day, he's a success if every moment of the day he spent serving God. How? You fill in the moments of the day with elements of service. Not by having a list of things that need to be done in the Shulchan Aruch, but by using your understanding of yourself and the world and the themes of the Torah to make sure that every moment is filled with service of God. Now, I'm overdrawing it because you could say for the tzaddik also, what about anything in times he's not doing something else, he should be learning Torah. That's true. But the attitude is different. The attitude here is, it's a relationship with God, and what I want is that he should be satisfied with his creation. Lasos nachas ruach le'avinu shebashamayim. Now, that's the highest form of divine service. That's the ideal form of divine service. Okay, that's all background. Now we get to chapter 26. By the way, the Sefer has 26 chapters. Can you guess why? It's the number, the gematria of Hashem's name. It has 10 stages in development. Can you guess why? Because there are 10 levels in Kabbalah. Moshe Chaim Luzzatto was the greatest Kabbalist after the Arizal of Chaim Vital. He comes next on the list of Kabbalists. When I wanted to know what Musa Sefer to learn, I asked my Rabbi Zatzal. He said, learn the Mesilas Yesharim because it's based on Kabbalah. So in the 26th chapter, he says, I'm now going to define for you what a chassid is and explain to you how a person becomes a chassid and in what circumstances he can be a chassid. And he says there are 3. One is a person who's learning all the time. Second, a person who's running his own business. And the third is a hired worker. All 3 can achieve the level of chassid. Of course, he says, what your activities are, what your challenges will be, what you emphasize in the 3 different contexts is different, that's true. But all 3 can achieve this title of chassid. Well, that's it, man. That's the top of the ladder. He's telling you that a person who's hired as a gardener to work by the hour to prune the plants can be a chassid. Not less than the Rosh Yeshiva. Not less. Doesn't say, but he's second class. Doesn't say that. This is the spirit with which the Chasidic movement looked at the world and said that about ladies were Berdichev was challenged. He said, "You're a Chasidim. Look at that. He's davening while he's greasing the wheels of his wagon." Rabbi Yitzchak said, other way around. He's greasing the wheels of his wagon while he's davening. And he said, he's davening while he's greasing the wheels of his wagon. What's the difference? The difference is that the critic is saying, he should be davening. And look at that. He's wasting his time and his effort doing the greasing the wheels instead of davening. And the Rabbi is saying, he's greasing his wheels because he has to make a living, because he has to support his family, because he's poor. But while he's greasing the wheels, he's davening. Because his whole day is davening. His whole life is davening. So here, again, the same idea of balance, of stress, of priorities. It's the same idea, and it's something which you can't. There's no rules in books to tell you that this is be this way and that should be done that way. It's something which has to be weighed up for every person's life. That kind of evaluation is going on all the time, and in the non-Chasidic movement, it's also going on, but it isn't as recognized and it isn't as publicized. As I have told you on prior occasions, there is in some places this false idea that, well, when you become a responsible adult, you make your own decisions. That's a terrible mistake. You don't make your own decisions in medicine. You don't make your own decisions in investing your spare cash. That one, of course, is only theoretical. You don't make the decisions in fixing your car. But in my ruchnius development, I make my own decisions. That's insanity. That's irresponsible insanity. So they do, in many cases, a bacha will go to the Rosh Yeshiva and say, I have this problem, or that option, or this challenge, and how should I handle it? And that's the right thing to do. In a yeshiva, in standard yeshivas, there are two leaders in the yeshiva. One is the Rosh Yeshiva, one is the mashkiach. Mashkiach is the one who is directly responsible for spiritual development. He's the one who speaks to the boys in general, as a group, about ruchnius stika, about spiritual subjects, and he's available for consultation. And without that, you're just running blind. Rav Ruderman, Chron Avracha, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of Bnei Yisrael in Baltimore, was learning in Europe in one of the yeshivas, I forget which one, and someone in the Jewish community was opening up a special yeshiva for exceptional students. Wanted to gather together all the really brightest ones. And he heard about it, and he was a phenomenally good student. So he went to the mashkiach and he said, I've heard about this proposal, and I'd like to know what I should do. So the mashkiach said, come, let's take a walk. Now, in this city, there was a river that went down the middle of the city. There was a bridge over the river. So the mashkiach took him out onto the bridge and said, jump in the water. Meaning, if you join this movement, you're committing spiritual suicide. You might as well kill yourself. So of course he didn't go. Someone else did. That someone else, when he came to America, became a conservative rabbi. And I was told by someone who was in Israel that they had a meeting. They had a meeting one time, Friday night, at Rav Ruderman's store. This other fellow from Europe, who I hadn't seen in, 30 years, showed up at his door. Knocks on the door. They recognize each other. Rav Ruderman takes him in and sits him down. And gave him something to eat or drink or whatever it was, and said, how are you? Where are you doing? Where have you been? They're talking and talking. And finally, Rav Ruderman says, where are you staying? Do you have a place to stay? Do you need lodging or something? And he says, no, my car is waiting. And then Ruderman saw with his own eyes what the mashkiach meant. Don't go to that place, because you're committing spiritual suicide. Now, how could, let's say Rav Ruderman was 20 years old, how could he know that? How could he predict that? There's no way he could know that. The mashkiach knew it. And he weighed it up. About maybe 20 years ago, less, 20 years ago, in Muncie, a Rav and a wealthy businessman wanted to open such a yeshiva for the best. And they came to Rav Aaron Leib Steinman, to ask him, and he said no. And fortunately, Rav Aaron Leib was such a tzaddik, such a gigantic tzaddik, that he came to America, from America to Israel to ask. He said no, he didn't do it. But how would they know? They wanted to do it. They were serious people. This Rav was a Rav. He knew a lot of Torah. He had a lot of Torah experience. These kinds of evaluations are going on all the time. So I think this This story and other similar stories about the Hasidic movement, where someone is given advice what to do and how to handle something, is something which it's a fabric of Jewish life. People stress the Shulchan Aruch. Yeah, oh, you have a set of rules. Just learn the rules and do them. It's not so simple. It's not so simple. I remember when I think it was before I became frum. I learned something about American law, American politics, which struck me as very wise, very important, and only later did I figure out that it was really wrong. And that was that we have a government of laws, not a government of people. Meaning we're not a dictatorship, and we're not an aristocracy. We have laws, and everybody has to live by the same laws. That is a dangerous half-truth, because the laws have to be interpreted, and they're interpreted by people. And once you get to the courts, and the courts have to decide a case, especially the Supreme Court, which can judge whether a law is constitutional or not, it's the interpretation of those people that determines what the law is for the country, at least in the meantime. So you can't escape people's judgment. It's not possible to escape people's judgment. So that being the case, once you recognize that, you understand the importance of being in contact with and in consultation with people like that. And also, you realize that when someone challenges you and says, it says right here in the Shulchan Aruch, you should do X, and you're not doing X, so you're wrong, you're bad, you're evil. He may be dead wrong. He may be dead wrong. Because according to the Mishnah Pirkei Avos, all these yeshivas today are wrong and bad and evil. They're not following what it says in the holy Mishnah. But they have reasons to do that. So you have to, it means that things are more fluid than it appears. I'll just end with one illustration. There's a problem Rosh Hashanah in the morning because you're going to daven Shachris, then you're going to blow shofar, then you're going to daven Musaf. Normal places, let's say, begin at 7 o'clock in the morning and end at 3 in the afternoon. But it's a holiday. As this is a holiday, you're not supposed to fast. And the rule is you're not supposed to fast beyond chatzos, beyond noon. So how do you handle that? So there are many suggestions, and also to fast before, to drink before Tkiyah Shofar. So some people content themselves with something early in the morning. Some people make Kiddush after Shachris, which is permissible as far as Kiddush is concerned, even though you're doing it before blowing the shofar. And they'll have wine and cake, to sustain themselves. There are various different ways to do it. I asked someone who was a brisker how they did it. I don't remember what his answer was, but it was one of the different ways that are accepted to do it. So I said, how did you decide to use this strategy rather than that strategy? And he said, I don't know, that's the way the Rav did it in Europe. I said to him, right. That's the right answer. That's the Hasidic answer. The holy person, the person who knew the most, the person who lived his life dedicated, that's what he chose to do. That's what I'm doing. I'm following him. That's the right answer. Because in the end, that element is present always. The element is present always. Yeah.
So, if Hashem desires chassid potentially to be more than tzaddik, first of all, is that a true statement?
Yeah,
Before I ask the next question.
Yeah, but it's put in a misleading way because, according to Mesilas Yesharim, whom I was quoting, you don't get to be a chassid until you're a tzaddik first.
Okay.
A chassid is in addition to being a tzaddik.
Okay. If that's the case, theory aside, in practice, in your life experience, would you say the Hasidic movement has produced more chassids than would have existed otherwise?
I think that's right. Okay, I'll let you finish your question.
No, that's the question.
So I think that's right, but I think
you're talking about something. Did it work?
So I think it's right, but I think it's right in a double sense. Because not only did the Hasidic movement emphasize a more balanced approach to developing a person's ruchnius, but although the other side often doesn't want to acknowledge it, it had a big effect on the other side also. They have not kept purely to their to their original principles, which is good. The effect of having Hasidim in their midst, the effect of having the influence of Hasidim in their midst, has the singing. One of the Gottleib of the previous generation, whose daughter went off and didn't stay from, was quoted as saying, "I didn't sing Zmiros by the Shabbos table. That was my failure." His attitude was, Friday night Suda, half hour, back to learning. Didn't serve him well. It's not obvious that that's the emphasis that... No. The Rambam writes that on Shabbos morning, you daven mincha early, and then you go home for Shal Shudas, and you eat and drink and say Shiros Nishbachos Ad Shetechshach until nightfall. That's a real Hasidic dish. That's a good 4 hours, 5 hours in the summer. Of course, you're saying Divrei Torah, and you're singing the piyutim of the Rishonim, but the context is Suda. Context isn't in the base medrash. So, there's a lot to say about that. All right, but this is what I wanted to talk to you about. This idea of balance is very, very important.